Many Rivers started this past Tuesday. Did anybody happen to catch the first episode? Excellent. All right. Well, we're going to be doing a few different things today. My piece of this presentation, first of all, we're going to be going through an overview of the whole series. So for those of you who saw the episode on Monday night, you're going to get a little look back at episode 1, and then a look at some of the other episodes in the series, so a sneak preview. And when I say sneak preview, some of the footage you're going to be seeing is very rough in that it still has the time codes. The episodes are actually still being put together. We've had some questions from stations across the country, and they're like, well, can you send me the whole complete thing? And I'm like, I haven't seen the whole complete thing yet. So some of the footage you'll be seeing is rough for the episodes that are closer to the end of the series. And then we're going to be taking some time to go through a sample lesson plan. We're creating a whole set of curricular resources related to the series. All of it is available for free. All of it is available on the Many Rivers website. But we want to make sure that you have tools to use the series and its associated resources in the classroom with your students. As we go through, if you have questions, please raise a hand, jump right in, let me know. And we will answer those. There's also going to be a lot of interactivity to what we're going to be doing. So you will be participating, contributing your thoughts and your ideas on how to best use the series and its resources with your students. How many of you have seen other series from Henry Louis Gates on PBS? Excellent. Can somebody just shout out some of the things you've seen that he's done with our programming? Black in Latin America, a great one that covers actually the history of African Americans in Latin America. What else? I heard genealogy series. One of the things, actually, for those of you who like his genealogy series, there will be another one this time next year. It's tentatively titled at this point, Finding Your Roots 2. But what he's done in a lot of his series, and I've had the great pleasure of working with him on several of them, African American Lives 2, and Oprah's Roots all looked at the idea of African American genealogy as a doorway into an understanding of African American history. Oprah had so much great content that she got her own special. The first 2 series had like 15 people each in them, but Oprah had her own show. In 2009, for the Lincoln Bicentennial, we had Looking for Lincoln, which was Dr. Gates traveling around the country and trying to understand both Abraham Lincoln the man and Abraham Lincoln the myth, and how the perception of Abraham Lincoln has changed over the course of time since his death. Faces of America was another one of the genealogy series. He started speaking to all different types of Americans about their genealogy and family history. Black in Latin America we heard about, and Finding Your Roots was the most recent genealogy series. But what he does in each of these series is uses individual stories and very personal stories of people oftentimes who are not famous, unsung heroes, to really illuminate the story of American history and the broader sweep of history, which is definitely something he's doing in Many Rivers. So in Many Rivers, not only do you get very, very well-known figures of American history, but you also get lesser-known people and lesser-known stories about how individuals on a day-to-day basis change the course of American history. All right, so thinking of that idea of individuals playing a role in larger history, we're going to get warmed up a little bit by thinking about some quotes that have been said by different African Americans over the course of American history. First one that we've got, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Sorry, who said that? Very good, Martin Luther King. Excellent. All right, so we've got that little image right there. Next one. You can't fight racism with racism. The best way to fight racism is with solidarity. Any guesses on that? I hear a lot of folks calling for Bobby Seale. Bobby Seale, absolutely. Great. Hope is the bedrock of this nation. Big hint there. The belief that our destiny will not be written for us, but by us, by all those men and women who are not content to settle for the world as it is, who have the courage to remake the world as it should be. Barack Obama, very good. And there we have an image of our president. All right, last one. This one's a little trickier. I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. Harriet Tubman, absolutely. All right. So you notice that all of these secondary images where you've got the person who said the quote are kind of designed to echo a particular time period and a particular place. All of these images and several more are available on the Many Rivers to Cross website as mini posters. So you can print these out in color on your printer from the website. We've got Harriet Tubman, we've got Jackie Robinson, Paul Robeson, Zora Neale Hurston, the Martin Luther King quote we saw, Thurgood Marshall, W.E.B. Du Bois, Barack Obama, Bobby Seale, and Audre Lorde. So all of these images are available. Again, you can print these out, use them on a bulletin board, use them to get discussions started with your students, but they're all available on the website and you can print them out. We laminated them, which also helps if you want to kind of maintain them from year to year. So as I said, the website, the URL for the website is pbs.org/manyrivers. Now, for those of you who missed the first episode on Tuesday night, the first episode is already on the PBS website. So the way it works is each episode is held until it's broadcast, and then once it's broadcast, it's available on the website. So by the end of November, the entire series, all 6 hours, will be available on the website. A lot of times people say, well, where can I buy the DVD for my classroom? For the next 5 years, the entire 6-hour series will be available streaming on the website. So as of now, you don't have to buy the DVD, although you can choose to do so. And if you watch it on Detroit Public Television at the end, they give you the info for ordering the DVD. But the whole thing is going to be available online, along with the posters and a whole bunch of really great content. So in depth, a little bit more about the series, and then we're actually going to watch some clips. As I said earlier, Many Rivers to Cross covers 500 years plus of African American history. Episode 1 covered a heck of a lot of ground on Tuesday night, from 1500 to 1800. But again, the way that Professor Gates chooses to do it is he picks some representative individual stories. He's not attempting to do a chronological history of first this happened, then this happened, then this happened. He's telling representative stories and experiences from key individuals in different periods of history. Episode 2, which will be on next Tuesday night, focuses on the age of slavery and really the rise of the plantation system. Episode 3, Into the Fire, covers both the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the very beginnings of the Jim Crow era. Episode 4, Making a Way Out of No Way, covers the Jim Crow era, leads up to the eve of World War II. Episode 5 covers World War II and the modern civil rights movement. And episode 6, It's Nation Time, takes us from the late 60s all the way through and concludes with the second inauguration of Barack Obama, as you saw. The series, again, October 22nd, this past Tuesday, until November 26th, which is the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. So once a week, Tuesday nights. And again, after each episode is on the air, it will be available on the Many Rivers to Cross website and also on the PBS video player. So you can access it in a variety of different places. One of the things that we're also doing to accompany the series is that each one of these episodes is also accompanied by curricular materials and lesson plans. So when you go to the Many Rivers website, after each episode is on the air, the episode's on the air, as well as educational materials that you can use with your students to teach the content of a particular part of that episode. So, episode 1 covers the earliest Africans to arrive in what later became the United States. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a brief clip from episode 1. And as you watch this clip, and then we're going to watch a clip from episode 2, what I'd like you to think about is, what are these clips telling you that you did not already know? What did you not previously know that you're getting from these clips? So let's take a look, Heather, at the clip from episode 1.
The American Revolution brought immense hope to the slaves. They heard the patriots talk of liberty and equality, and it ignited their own dreams. But for the most part, those dreams were ignored. Even the greatest champion of freedom was hesitant to extend it to black people. This is Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate. For so many of us, an icon of American independence. But for more than 100 African Americans, this was a plantation, where from sunup to sundown, they toiled as slaves. The father of our country was also one of its largest slave owners. Slaves tended his fields and watched over his every need. One worked in these stables, a groomsman named Harry Washington. Harry heard the talk around Mount Vernon about liberty and independence, but he sensed it wasn't meant for slaves. So like many black people, he decided to take his chances with the British.
Once the war comes, there are enslaved men and women saying, hey, we'd love to help you out if you would help us out. We'd be happy to help you suppress this rebellion in Massachusetts if you will grant our freedom in return.
Harry joined a loyalist regiment called the Black Pioneers, and he wasn't the only one. Roughly 20,000 slaves ran away to the British lines, far more than joined the Patriot cause.
There were a lot of Harry Washingtons in the British Army. In fact, it's probably fair to say that especially in the southern colonies, the British Army effort could not have been as successful as it was for a time without the assistance of former slaves.
Unfortunately, most of these black loyalists were ravaged by the war.
Many of them died. Many of them contracted smallpox. They met terrible fates, many of them, but you can understand why they opted for it. That gives you a measure of what slavery was like, that people would take that kind of risk.
Harry Washington was one of the lucky few. In the waning days of the war, the British put him on a ship and evacuated him to Canada.
The British definitely wanted to use the blacks to help them in their struggle against the colonists, but they did not want to, had no intention of actually making them, equal to them and bringing them and making them part of British society. So drop them off there and let them make their way.
Harry didn't stay long in Canada. He and his fellow black loyalists were barred from voting and exploited by local whites. So when the British set up a colony for former slaves back in Sierra Leone, Harry was among the first to emigrate.
Is our clip from episode 1, and before we discuss it, we're actually going to go right into the clip for episode 2, and I heard a rumor. Is there anyone here from Canada? We got a couple folks from Canada scattered around the room. Actually, both of these clips, I didn't even think of it, and we were speaking about the clips last night. Both of these clips have something to do with Canada. So we're going to go right into, if you click ahead, Heather, you'll get the box for clip episode 2. And we're going to go right into that clip, and then we'll discuss.
Part folklore, part propaganda, the Underground Railroad was never as large as we often imagine. But it was real. This is one of the few documented safe houses on the Underground Railroad, and the site of at least one remarkable escape.
Mary Corbett heard a knock on the door, and it was an enslaved man who was fleeing, and the sheriff was after him. And he pleaded to her to help him. So she brings him into the house, and they go all the way up to the attic area, and she points to a very, very, very small little door in the eaves and suggests that he try to crawl in there and hide himself. And there's a pounding on the door. The sheriff and his posse are with him, and she opens the door and lets them in. And she tells them they're welcome to search any room in the house. Stop, turn around. And here's the cupboard that Sam hid in.
That?
Yes, Mary Corbett brought him up here, and he squeezed himself in there.
My God, it's just so tiny.
And the sheriff decided not to look, because they didn't think that a man could fit in there.
They would have just caught me. 'Cause I'm too claustrophobic to go in there. I just said, look, let's make a
But
deal.
if the sheriff is after you with his dogs and guns, he might find a way.
That's incredible. No wonder they didn't look there.
Right.
Amazing. Infuriated by all the runaways, Southerners pushed for harsh laws to staunch the flow, culminating in the notorious Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a watershed moment in American history. The law required Northerners to help capture anyone even accused of being a runaway slave, turning the North into a police power for the South. It also placed every free black person in terrible danger.
Every time you walked on the street, you were subject to being claimed as a slave. You're living every day afraid and watching over your shoulder to make sure that you're not being watched by someone who was looking for you or someone else, and will happily take you if they can't find the someone else.
As bounty hunters flooded northern cities, black people began to look for freedom in ever more distant places. Small numbers had been running away to Canada since the Revolutionary War. Now, they began to come here, to Niagara Falls on the Canadian border, in droves. Why Canada? No slavery. And no slavery meant no slave catchers. In Canada, a black person could serve on a jury. A black person could vote. A black person could own property. A black person could become a citizen. Canada was for black people what the United States was for white people, the land of the free, the home of the brave. Over 10,000 African Americans fled to Canada in the 1850s, including the most well-known conductor of the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman. Tubman settled here in the tiny town of St. Catharines and joined this church, which became a hub for runaways. There are black families still living in this town who trace their roots back to those runaways, people whose ancestors took an almost unimaginable risk.
Here is just one portion of the descendant wall from 1838 all the way to today. So this is portions of the Casile family.
You had to get out of the South, and you were on your own. What did you have? You didn't have a map, you didn't have the education, you had nothing. So you had to be able to rely on the North Star and yourself.
I want to point out my immediate family. So this is on my mother's side.
This is the home team.
Yeah, this is my mom's mom.
And then bounty hunters are after you. So there was a lot at risk, and not many would do it. And those that did, I mean, it's documented. You had to be a little bit bent.
You had to be, you had to be totally crazy.
Yeah. When I was a youngster, we knew of the stories, but I never appreciated any of it and never looked back or even thought about it until I was grown. And then it's like, my God, my people did that? Mm-hmm. That's how we got here?
The very existence of these families, an entire community of people descended from escaped slaves, is a testament to their strength.
When I think about the Underground Railroad, it makes me want to claim slaves, right, as my ancestors, because they were genius in order to pull something off like this. I think about this and I think, wow, you know, slavery is not a shame on me, because my ancestors were some of the most creative, resourceful people in the history of the United States. That's a shame on the slaveholders. But there's no stigma that I bear by being descended from people who could do something like that.
Great. What we're going to do is move on to episode 3. And one of the things I wanted to point out is, you know, because the fact that Dr. Gates is telling the story of the country through the story of individuals, the series presents these little nugget-like stories that are just brief, 5 to 7 minutes. You can lift them right out of the entire series. You know, you don't have to spend 6 hours with your students watching the whole thing, but you can lift out these specific stories and these small bits to communicate a particular theme or topic. Even that thought of, you know, the story didn't end when slaves made it to Canada. The story continued and communities thrived and they went on and they've, you know, descended to the present day. This clip from episode 3 focuses on the story of Robert Smalls. Does anybody know who Robert Smalls is? Yeah, could we hear from back there? Absolutely. And his later claim to fame, anyone know what his later claim to fame was? He became a congressman. This is a story that not a lot of folks know, but it is a great story talking of and thinking of that idea of resistance to slavery. This is a story of Robert Smalls during the Civil War. He later did become a congressman, but the story of how he obtained his freedom is pretty amazing. So I do know this clip is pretty dark, so if we could douse the lights a little bit. And Heather, if you could play the clip from episode 3.
When the Civil War began, more than 3.9 million slaves faced a terrible choice: to be forced to aid a Confederate army they despised, or gamble everything on escape. 500,000 chose to break and run. Not only would they change the tide of war, they would change its meaning, turning a war about union into a war about slavery. One of my favorite stories of the Civil War happened right here at the Battery, just a year after the outbreak of the war over at Fort Sumter. As Charleston slept, a young black man, a slave, plotted his escape aboard a ship. Robert Smalls was a 23-year-old slave pressed into service for the Confederacy aboard a warship called the Planter. For nearly a year, he quietly observed the movements of the ship and its crew. Just before dawn on May 13, 1862, Smalls took his chance. While the ship's officers slept ashore, he and his fellow slave crewmen pulled anchor and eased the Planter into Charleston Harbor.
They had prearranged to meet their family members and to pick them up and then come back down the peninsula, and they begin the process, and this is in the wee hours of the morning, of sailing out of the harbor. They are embarked now on an extremely dangerous journey.
Smalls knew these waters like the back of his hand, but he also knew the risks that lay ahead. 4 Confederate checkpoints: Castle Pinckney, Fort Ripley, Fort Johnson, and Fort Sumter. Isn't Smalls afraid of being caught? How in the world is a black slave going to pull this off?
He's extremely afraid of being caught. He disguises himself as the captain and also mimics the captain's gait as he walked back and forth across the wheelhouse.
Smalls slipped past the first 3 checkpoints undetected. The most dangerous checkpoint remained: Fort Sumter, with its mighty guns and fearsome cannons. Discovery would mean certain death. As dawn broke, the crew urged Smalls to take a wide berth, but changing course could arouse suspicion. Smalls gave the signal. A few seconds later, the counter signal came back. Pass on by. So they're safe, right? They're free?
Well, they're not completely free, because now we have the situation where a Confederate flagged vessel is sailing out and it begins to approach the vessels of the Union naval blockading force.
Fortunately, the vessel was not fired on. As astonished Union officers boarded the Planter, Smalls stood at attention, saluted, and spoke.
I am delivering this war material, including these cannons, and I think Uncle Abraham Lincoln can put them to good use.
Smalls was ready.
That's
ready
right.
with his line for history. I like
That's
that.
right. That's right.
I don't know exactly what you are now, the officer told Smalls, but you're certainly no longer slaves.
Excellent. So again, a really, really incredible story of American history. How many of you were familiar with the specifics of that story? Couple of you here and there. Now, my question for you is this. Many of you may not teach Robert Smalls specifically in your classrooms, but where could you fit this story into your larger curriculum? Where might you be able to use this story and tell this story with your students in your larger curriculum? In a Civil War unit? Any other ideas? You could absolutely, as you're talking about African Americans in the Civil War, and last week we were doing this workshop elsewhere, and a teacher said, you know, I always teach my students about African Americans who fought for the North, but the stories of African Americans who were in the South, who resisted slavery during the war and were pushing back on the system while being in the South, you could absolutely share this story. Great. Moving on, episode 4. I actually don't have a clip from episode 4, and this is the one that Dr. Pilgrim and the Jim Crow Museum are featured in. This really focuses on the Jim Crow era, touches briefly on the Harlem Renaissance, talks about some early African-American leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois, I.W. Wells. It discusses the American Negro exhibit at the 1900 World's Fair. So it really looks at kind of the rise of everything Dr. Pilgrim was speaking about as he was speaking about how the images of Jim Crow really proliferated and poisoned the minds of several generations of people. Episode 5 covers both World War II and the modern civil rights movement. And I do know for a fact, not the clip we're going to see, but there are several excerpts from episode 5 that's focused, as we were talking about local history, focus specifically on Detroit. So there's an extended segment about Motown. There are clips from Martin Luther King's visits to Detroit, as well as Malcolm X's visits to Detroit. So Detroit plays a very, very large role thinking about local history in episode 5. Before I show you this clip, what I want you to think about as you watch this excerpt from episode 5 is, what do you think, how important do you think the role of the media was in the civil rights movement? And how do you think you'd need to talk to your students about the media at this time versus the media today if you were to show this clip? So Heather, if we could show the clip from episode 5.
2 years ago.
For the next few years, however, Dr. King's nonviolent civil disobedience continued to dominate civil rights strategy as the movement spread across the country.
I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
The more civil rights protesters suffered violence and even death, the clearer the justice of their cause became, and the harder it became to ignore. The civil rights movement reached a climax on March 7, 1965, when a peaceful march for voting rights from Selma to Montgomery turned into what would become known as Bloody Sunday.
We're marching today to dramatize to the nation, dramatize to the world, that hundreds and thousands of Negro citizens denied the right to vote.
I remember so well on that particular day. We came to the highest point on the bridge. Down below we saw a sea of blue, Alabama State Troopers. And a man identified himself and said, I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march, will not be allowed to continue.
This is Major Cloud talking, marching this way.
And you saw these guys putting on their gas masks. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I thought I was going to die. I thought I saw death.
The brutality at Selma was broadcast on national television.
Programs normally seen at this time will not be broadcast.
48 million people across the country watched as peaceful protesters were attacked by police with nightsticks and tear gas. John Lewis once said that without television news coverage, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings or a choir without a song. Do you think that's fair?
I think this fight for righteousness, for justice, really for the honor of the country, it would have been a long time for the movement to succeed. Television was the instrument that, to use John Lewis's metaphor, had people hear the choir.
Once our people were totally and terribly brutalized here.
By transforming the movement into a kind of televised morality play, Dr. King was able to appeal to people of faith across the country, many of whom began to join his cause.
What's extraordinary about nonviolence is that nonviolence helps you get the clergy leaders, whether Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, the kind of alliances that were needed.
After Bloody Sunday, hundreds of clergy, including rabbis Mark Tannenbaum and Abraham Joshua Heschel, came to Selma in a show of unity. The outrage following the brutality in Selma incited demonstrations in over 80 cities across America. Once again, the treatment of its black citizens was becoming a liability to a nation trying to be the face of democracy around the world. The South was a national embarrassment. Congress and the White House were compelled to act.
It's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice.
March 15, 1965, President Lyndon Baines Johnson astonished the nation by invoking the phrase that had become the mantra of the movement.
And we shall overcome.
I watched that speech in our living room on our little black and white TV with my parents. Even then, at that age, tears came to my eyes. A few months later, President Johnson would sign our nation's first Voting Rights Act. Just 10 years following the Montgomery bus boycott, a revolution had occurred. The passage of the Voting Rights Act was the high watermark of a decade of struggle for civil rights.
Great. On episode 6. Episode 6 is in an editing room in New York City right now. I don't have any of episode 6 to show you. I think they were still filming bits and pieces of episode 6 about a week ago, so that episode is really coming together. And obviously, the clip you saw from episode 5 where you saw the NBC News timestamp and the rolling numbers, all of that will be removed by the time the episode goes on the air. The final episode focuses on 1968 to 2013, really looking at growing class disparity among African Americans, advances in the African American middle class. There is a big section, actually, that I find pretty compelling that I've seen the very, very rough cuts on, focusing on Hurricane Katrina and the conversations that started about race. And really, episode 6 looks at, okay, we've now taken a look at 500 years of African American history, what's next? And that will be the episode that airs the Tuesday night before Thanksgiving. So that is the series. Beyond the broadcast, we've got a couple different things going on. First of all, We're doing teacher training workshops in 15 different cities across the country, in addition to New York, where we're talking to teachers, again, about using this series to engage your students and get your students interested. In addition to the outreach events we're doing, there is a book, and I understand that some copies of the book are going to be given away as door prizes at the end of today's event. But Dr. Gates has written a book, Many Rivers to Cross, as kind of a parallel to the series. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the website, pbs.org/manyrivers. So on the website, we've got the educational resources, the lesson plans that we're going to be talking about, video, the full series, as well as some kind of DVD extras, what didn't make it into the series, and extended interviews are on the website. There are some interactive features, the posters I showed you earlier, and a variety of blog entries on a wide variety of topics in African American history written by Dr. Gates. So all of that is on the website. Again, the website is going to be up for many years to come. So all of it will be there, and the videos will be posted the day after they're on the air on television. Very quickly, also, how many of you are aware of PBS Learning Media? PBS Learning Media is a free online repository of educational video and resources. So all of the content from Many Rivers, the education content, will be available on the Many Rivers website, and it will also be placed in PBS Learning Media. If you get a chance, you should absolutely log into pbslearningmedia.org, and it is a repository of content from PBS stations all across the country, going back several years, so that teachers can log in and use these series in the classroom with their students. So take some time to go in there. The Many Rivers resources will be in there later this fall.